On today's episode, we talk about growing up in a funeral home.
And we have a very special guest, our older brother, Cappaulli.
It's Cappaulli again.
From a funeral director's perspective, from a new trainee of being a funeral director, and from a doctor of clinical psychology, we all had the same experience of growing around death, and we're going to talk about it.
So listen in as we talk about how it was growing up in and around the funeral home.
You'll love it.
Let's talk about death, baby. Let's talk about grief and mourning. Is it argumental or existential? What's it mean to me? Let's talk about death.
Hi, I'm Benny Cappaul, and I'm a funeral professional.
And I'm Nicholas Cappaul, psychologist.
Hey, Nick, let's talk about death.
Let's do it.
Today's episode, we're going to talk about growing up in the funeral home, and we are pleasantly, yet again, we are here with our older brother, Cappaulli. Thanks, Cappaulli, for being on the show, and Dr. Nick, of course, is with us as well. We're going to talk about growing up in the funeral home. So why don't we start with Cappaulli? What is your experience of growing up in the funeral home?
It's a unique experience, and it's wild because from the time I was a child, this was just what I've known. It's what I've grown up with. So going to school, you'd have different kids that ask you all these crazy questions, and some people wouldn't talk to you because they didn't get it. Like, they never realized that we grew up in a house next to a funeral home, right? They thought we lived in the funeral home.
Are you sure that's because we lived next to a funeral home, or just because it was you that they weren't talking to you?
Well, I was kind of an awkward kid to begin with. I was a little shrimpy, weird kid that listened to ICP and dress goth and all that.
Yet again, are we sure that it's the funeral home why people weren't talking to you, Cappaulli? Yeah, keep going. I'm sorry for interrupting.
But no, growing up, I was always proud. I wanted to be a funeral director when I was a kid. So I always, spoke very highly of my dad, my brothers, my family. But when we were young, we played in the funeral home. We would play tag in the funeral home. We played with Army men in the funeral home. It was just the way of life.
Dr. Nick, how do you feel? What was your experience of growing up in the funeral home?
Eye-opening. I think it really gave me a perspective on death that most people don't get because I'm always around it. And as a young person, I never was trained, I guess, or educated on being afraid of it. It was more of an open situation. Mom would say, hey, go get dad. And sometimes you'd have to go in the morgue to find dad. And dad would be, it's just like My Girl, that scene in My Girl where she comes down the steps and dad is working on a body and she's kind of talking to him like, hey, just normal stuff. And I guess that's the reality, right? It just becomes part of your reality. It's just another job. You don't think about it as this dead person in the room. You just think about dad's working right now and I got to go get him for dinner. So I think my experience, in all honesty, has really reflected in how I view death today. So I guess that's my answer. I don't know if it's a great one, but let's go with that.
I like it. And I just want to go back to your My Girl question or thought, because Ray Stantz, right? He would embalm the body and then he would bust the ghost. So, those are all things that kind of go into that. But yeah, my experience, and this is Benny talking, my experience was I didn't know any different, right? You grew up, you played
Junior.
You played basketball and rollerbladed out in the parking lot, and a car would come in and you kind of move out and they would be going in to talk about arrangements or funerals, and Dr. Nick and I wouldn't think anything of it, but then also you would you get a Christmas present, and because it was so crappy outside, we got scooters and we couldn't be outside. And I remember riding our scooters around the funeral home because that was the only way we could ride them. It's that thing where it's just life, the funeral home wasn't any different from anybody else's home, but now that you grow up and you're realizing people are so weirded out and afraid of funeral homes, it does put a different perspective on it. But yeah, absolutely. Going back to Dr. Nick, what he said, we were always taught about death. So death wasn't really scary, or it really wasn't out of the blue or unnormal. It was just part of life. It was part of what we kind of grew up to do. But with that, as we got older, you do start, especially in your teenage years, you start putting in the thoughts of the afterlife and what comes next and what dad actually did or does still, but back then I'm talking. And it is a little different as you get older, right? Because I think we all kind of mentioned our childhood, but let's talk about our adolescent now, right? We're in high school. Chris is still awkward. He was awkward to begin with. Still
Down with the
awkward.
clown.
Cappaulli, he's
Jinko
still
jeans.
awkward. Dr. Nick, still looking up to his younger brother. Really, our friendship really blossomed when we were in high school, right? Cappaulli was teaching us the ropes of how to be, things we probably shouldn't have been getting into.
How to be
with,
band geeks, right?
Parental advisory CD. Sorry, mom, that were snuck into the home, or other things we'll talk about probably on a later show, podcast. But I think Dr. Nick, we'll start with you. Your adolescent years, like growing up in a funeral home, how did that equate?
In my teenage years, it was interesting because I started realizing that most people at my classmates or colleagues or whatever would ask me more in-depth questions versus when you're a kid. It's like, oh, your dad's a funeral director, you're weird. When you get to teenage years, they start actually asking you some better questions, I guess, some more appropriate questions, like, what is that like, or how do you feel about that? And I think with the background that I've been raised in, it's been easier and easier as I get older to answer those questions. Because again, as a teenage boy, I really didn't think about living in or around a funeral home really did to me, I guess. And then as you get older, you start really respecting what you're learning and what you're seeing. And most people, unfortunately, don't get that lesson. So I think that's my teenage years was that it was a very eye-opening, again, experience because it opened me up to how to speak to people about exploring death topics.
Good answer. Cappaulli, your thoughts on being an adolescent in the funeral home?
Well, I want to piggyback off of what Dr. Nick was saying, because what's also interesting growing up in a funeral home when you're an adolescent is you expose your friends to the funeral home too. You expose them to that lifestyle. So, you're now sharing, not anything real intimate or confident, but you're sharing things with them that they never understood, that they never know. So they kind of are in training as your friend as well, because they have to be understanding to, like you said, Benny, about how there are times that, hey, plans might have to change because we have a party we're going to, but we get busy, or, we have something where all of a sudden, boom, dad's got to leave. And, our friends weren't really used to that at first. So it was also kind of, like I said, training them into that too, that lifestyle of, hey, this is what we're exposed to. This is what we're around. This is what we do. You get those crazy questions where they're like, is this really what happens? Is this what goes on behind the scenes? And the more and more you talk about it, then you start to see that they're also more familiar with it too. And that's amazing thing too. Like you're kind of spreading that and they're making that like awareness to them that they can go back to their families and say, oh yeah, the Cappaulli boys aren't weird. What they're doing is great and their community appreciates it. So you're also in a way kind of passing that on to your friends too, if that makes any sense. Your friends and your, extended family that may not know or understand what's going on. So I think a lot of our adolescence revolved around that. It was incorporating the people in our lives that we loved, cared about, and wanted to spend time with. Like, hey, if you're going to run with us, you're kind of going to run with the funeral home as well.
Well, and then you fast forward to adulthood, and it's surprising to me that a lot of my friends, a lot of our close friends, which Cappaulli, Benny, and I all share. It's interesting to me that as we get older, we start noticing that these people are starting to openly talk about this stuff. Like, hey, I was just thinking about my own death and blah, blah, blah. And we're like, yeah, we're still pretty young. We're all in our 30s and stuff. But it's beautiful that Benny Cappaulli and I have planted seeds in our friends it's okay to talk about this stuff. It's okay to challenge what your beliefs are, or to look at what is the future pose. Now that we have children, right, we're now looking at our demise, right? And it's very dark and sad to think of it that way, but that's the reality, right? We're born to die. And it's great that now as adults, we're starting to see our friends come around to our ways of thinking, I guess would be the best way to approach that. And it really has become these very valuable conversations. A lot of adults will talk about, you become adults and then you start talking about 401ks and all this stuff.
Escrow.
The thing is that a lot of people still don't go to that point of death. Like, what's that going to look like? What do I want to leave behind? What is my legacy I want to leave behind? And it's interesting to me that all of our group of close friends that are friends with all of us, because we're really close in age, all three of us, all the listeners out there. But the thing is that for all of our friends that are close to all of us and have heard all these stories and been around the funeral home, that they will say, like, talk about like their own death and like what they want and what they're teaching their children and stuff. And I think that's the valuable point, is that we have planted that seed way back then when we first started talking about death, and people were like, oh, they're weirdos, right? And then they moved past 15 years and now they're talking to their children about death, and it's amazing. Like, that's what we wanted to do, and that's why this podcast exists, is that hopefully we're reaching out enough of an audience that you're talking to your kids about this stuff.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Dr. Nick, for skipping over me to talk about my adolescence. So I do appreciate that. So me growing up in my adolescence and dealing with growing up in a funeral home, I want to bring up a couple things that my brothers, maybe alluded to. One is the expectations of being children of a funeral director. As we were growing up and becoming high schoolers, obviously that's when a lot of kind of the rebellious comes out in all of us. And I remember our father telling us there were certain things that we couldn't do, or we couldn't have our names in the paper for anything bad because it reflects the funeral home. And growing up, that's very challenging, especially when you're a teenager, because of course you want to rebel against everything. I was always kind of known as the bad boy of the bunch.
That's very untrue. Ben was the suck up.
Well, thank you, Dr. Nick, yet again for interrupting me. But yeah, so expectations, we had to be class X. We had to represent not only our father in the right light, but also the funeral home. And our last name carried a lot of weight. And that was very challenging. I think that's where we all get a lot of our anxiety and stress that all three of us carry. The other thing, no offense, Dad, but that's just kind of being the sons of funeral directors. The other thing that I do want to talk about also, and you guys talked about it too, is kind of talking to our friends about death, right? And, the more that they were around us, I think the less they actually thought about the funeral home. That's kind of another illusion that, we don't look at the funeral home as a funeral home. We look at it like a house part two, right? It's just something that was part of the collect. I mean, it's basically like a barracks here. You got the funeral home, and then you got our growing up home, which is now my home, and a parking lot that separates the two. So it's just one big home, basically, or house. The parking lot was just a playground. And the funeral home was just a place Dad worked, but it was also kind of just an extension of our house. And our grandparents lived above it for a while, so we would go up there and have popcorn and even forget that we were in a funeral home. And I think with our friends and people who knew us or were around that, I think after about a couple times, you almost forget that you're at a funeral home. And so I've heard that a lot. Like, it's so weird that, I'd be playing or, we would be listening to music out in the barn or our house, and then I would have this like recollection, we're at a funeral home, and it's very interesting. And a lot of funeral directors are like that. Once we aren't in the funeral home, or once there isn't a funeral, we're normal people. We're not always talking about death or, in fact, I would say we were absolutely trying to do the opposite when we're not at work, right? We don't want to talk about work. But yeah, I think growing up, that was one of the big things, was the extra responsibility we all had of carrying that last name, the Cappaulli name. And then also being able to, like Dr. Nick said, plant the seeds in our friends about death. But now let's kind of get into the...
you brought up a good point, right? We're talking about legacy, right? And then what's next for Cappaulli Funeral Home, right? What are, I guess, our three thoughts on where do we want to go with this?
Cappaulli, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to say that obviously I want to become a funeral director. That's what I'm working towards right now. This is the job that I want to retire or do the rest of my life. This is my end game. But, Benny and I have been talking a lot about our children, and even Dr. Nick's children too. Like, the hope is that without pressure or pushing, that maybe one of our kids want to continue to walk with the torch. I have 3 beautiful girls, and Benny's got a beautiful boy and girl, and Dr. Nick's got a beautiful boy and girl. So we have a lot of opportunities and options. The hope is that this is 4th generation, Benny. We're 4th generation.
We're 4th.
So 5th generation would be amazing. 6th generation, so on and so forth. Capaulis have been around since the early 1900s, which is incredible to think. And there's just our entire family has revolved around this area in Ida. I think it was, who mentioned the apartment? Was that Dr. Nick earlier about the grandparents living up there?
It doesn't really matter.
That was you. Sorry, that was Benny. So, even the apartment above the funeral home, in our late adolescence, early adulthood, we've all lived up there at one point too. And I always would joke to people, when I go to school or anywhere that, if I blindfolded you and took you upstairs to the apartment, you'd have no idea that you were in a funeral home. You have no clue. There's that common misconception that a funeral home is this creepy dungeon with...
Dungeon? Who was talking that it's a dungeon?
It's a beautiful building. It's a beautiful place that, we hang out and spend time at too. When we're not working, our kids are running around having fun upstairs. Benny mentioned the parking lot. We're rollerblading and, shooting hoops and having parties and stuff. So that's another cool thing to think about too. A lot of these funeral homes back in the day, they lived above. So you have houses or apartments above that look like any other house. And it's a very, very comfortable setting. So when we're not working, we're normally relaxing up there. We're watching shows, hanging out, doing stuff with our kids.
Well, and I think that's the beautiful part about a good funeral home, right? Is the last word. It's a home. It's a place where you can come and feel comfortable and share your thoughts and feelings. And it doesn't have to be a scary thing. And if you come and meet Benny or my dad or Cappaulli now, you're going to feel at home. And that's the beautiful part of this whole thing.
Absolutely. And the legacy that I would say, what I see for Cappaulli Funeral Home in the future is we got to educate. And I think Cappaulli, Dr. Nick, and our father are doing a great job, because the honest to God situation that we're dealing with, especially with this pandemic and this virus, is people are not seeing the value in a funeral anymore. And all 3 of us sitting here on this podcast can tell you the importance that we've seen through the eyes of grieving spouses, mothers, cousins. It is important. It is extremely important. There's a quote that Dr. Nick and I say all the time. You can judge a community by the way that they treat their dead. And that's the honest to God. And the saddest part is with today's society and today not wanting to deal with grief. The more that we're not dealing with grief, the more that we're seeing mental health. I mean, mental health is just on the rise, and it's going to keep going as long as we don't take in consideration grief. And I think what Cappaulli Funeral Home and what Cappaulli, Dr. Nick, I, and our father are really trying to do is educate the public on the importance of not only the funeral and the funeral home and what we do as a profession, but also how people can deal with their grief. And I think that's honestly what's next for Cappaulli Funeral Home. That's what we're going to keep doing as long as people want and need us, which I think personally funeral directors are needed and funeral homes are needed. We're going to be here, and we'll be here for you when you need us. So that's what I got to say about that.
Well, Benny, I think it's that time of the show.
It's that Q&A time.
Q&A, everyone loves that Q&A.
Gotta get me that
Cappaulli loves those Q&As.
All right, so first question is legacy, and I believe this is for Benny specifically. Since you are a 4th generation funeral director, did you feel the pressure to follow in the footsteps, and what has changed from when your family started the funeral home?
Oh, so 2 good questions here. The first one is absolutely, and I think all the brothers can attest that we all felt a little pressure into becoming funeral professionals one way or another. A, just because we all looked up to our father, but B, one of us had to do it, right? One of us had to become it. So when it was coming down the line and, David said no, Cappaulli said no, Dr. Nick at the time was kind of on and off with it. And if we've talked about this before, but if you don't know this as a listener, Dr. Nick actually wanted to be the funeral director first. I wanted to be a psychologist. And while I was in college, decided I did not want to go through 10 years. That sounds horrible, right, Dr. Nick? Yeah,
It is absolutely a nightmare.
So Dr. Nick actually switched and went through the psychology route, and I switched and went through the funeral. So Dr. Nick could have been the funeral director, and I could have been Dr. Benny. So just interesting.
And for all the listeners out there, I hope one day eventually I will get my funeral director's license. It's just I'm not ready to go back to school right now.
So answering the first question, did I feel pressure? Absolutely, because at that time nobody was going to step into those funeral directors' suit shoes. So I did. What has changed from when my family started? Well, there's a lot more paperwork. We are killing a lot more trees nowadays. I heard of stories of contracts were done shaking hands, and when you used to come to a funeral director, they used to tell you when the funeral was going to be, when the visitation was going to be, and there was no questions asked. This is when we're doing it. This is when the funeral is. And let's be honest, back then you could take off work. There wasn't questions about you can't get out, or I need a note from the funeral home or all that. There was a lot more trust in that. Nowadays, you have to sign all this contract, these paperwork. Families are either rushing sometimes or sometimes asking for a couple weeks before you do funerals. And that's just because you can't get off work anymore. People are rushed. People can't get off work, or they have a grandkid that's flown in from New Hampshire, and they need to get the funeral done at certain times. One of the big things I've seen, and let's be honest, we're moving away from faith-driven funerals. So in my father's and his father's and his father's and his father's generation, you went to church, you had the funeral, and you had the visitation at the funeral home, you went to the church for the funeral, you went to the cemetery for burial after. It was a bang, bang, bang. That was how it was done. And back then you had 2 days of visitation. Now we're only having one, possibly, or doing everything in a couple hours. I mean, it's just everything is extremely rushed. That's the big difference I'm finding. And I'm also finding that we have so much, we know everything now with the internet. So people are expecting more from funeral directors, but not willing to almost sometimes pay more for the same service that they're given. So it's a challenge. It's a very challenge, but it's so rewarding to be a funeral professional. Dr. Nick, your thoughts?
Well, and it's also moving to that Zoom funeral, right? And I don't want to take up time on this episode because I think we need to have an episode on Zoom funerals, but it has changed, right? It has changed in how we our community, right? We're coming in, and as a community, touch, feel, smell, all these things we can't get through a Zoom, but yet we're fighting so desperately to make Zoom such a big deal.
Dr. Nick, you brought this up in an earlier podcast, and I can't remember what one. We've moved from a community-based society to an individual-based society, and I think that really hits home.
Well, I'm glad that you brought up my thoughts because they are golden.
They are
golden.
Every once in a while, a squirrel finds a nut.
Well, thank you.
Fool's gold.
Cappaulli, you have any thoughts on that? What's changed in the funeral profession in your eyes?
I actually don't have a lot of feedback.
Beautiful, because I was going to fall asleep
Yep,
if you were going to say anything.
That was probably the
All
best
right, so
answer.
here's question
Fool's
2.
gold.
I'm going to throw this up to Cappaulli first. Growing up around death, how long did it take you to adjust to seeing dead bodies? Question 1. Do you feel since you've grown up around it, you are numb to death? Question 2. And then the last question, how do you deal with it?
I don't remember the first dead body I saw, but I can say anytime it's somebody that I have a personal connection to, it's a lot harder. Family members, especially. Actually, a really interesting story. My best friend, he lost his grandfather, very, very close to him. And at the funeral, it was a beautiful, beautiful service. And because their family's Irish, they did Danny Boy. And I remember that song hitting really hard. The arrangement was beautiful and the singer was outstanding, so that didn't help. But I remember seeing his grandfather. I remember seeing him and his family all crying and sobbing and struggling with it. And there is, as cryptic as it sounds, there is kind of a beauty in that community. So it's hard to see it, but you're there for them. And I think if you can stay strong, and I think if you can and try to be there for them as much as possible. But growing around it, I don't think it's really made me numb. I know my mortality. It's scary sometimes if you start thinking too much. You kind of go down a rabbit's hole. But dealing with it, talk about it. It's the easiest way to deal with it. Talk about it. Don't be ashamed, and ask for feedback. I'm blessed that I have a family that's surrounding death, dying, grief, and loss. So the more you talk about it, the easier it gets.
Benny Boy Slim, what do you think?
Danny boy, the pipes are calling. Thank you, Cappaulli, for that. Yes,
I'd cry if I was there from hearing that rendition.
I'm crying just listening to you right now. I remember seeing dead bodies when I was younger, and honestly, I don't think they really did faze me. And I think it was the way that my father approached it. I remember him always having an open door policy with his children around dead bodies. And I remember specifically, and this is something I do, and Cappaulli can attest to this, he would always call them by their first name. So right away, it was humanized that these were actual people. He would usually have a story if he knew who they were. This was this is my grade school teacher. This was the local grocery store owner. So I remember those kind of little tidbits the way that he would come across, it didn't scare me. It was just, that was okay, that's Bert in there. And that's the same way I talk to my children, as I call them by their names. And now every time I close a casket, I always say, I'll see you later, and I always say the first name. Because I'm trying to really humanize and really be in the moment, because at times we as funeral professionals are always on the clock, and I think we lose track of actually what we're doing and how important it is to what we're doing. So that's going to be that question. Do you feel, since you've grown up, you become numb to death? I would say there is a piece to every funeral professional that has become a little bit numb, not necessarily desensitized, but there is a little bit of compartmentalizing when it comes to being a professional in our profession. Because we have to, or at least we were taught that we had to keep our emotions in check because we have to direct a funeral. So I think there is a little bit of self-teaching, which I think can cause many issues. I am high stressed. I am highly anxious. And I think part of that is because I haven't had enough good cries in my life, because I've been taught to keep it in, whether dad meant to or didn't mean to. It was just how it happened. And how do I deal with it? How do I deal with growing up around death? I think it's just normal. It's normalized to me. And it makes me humanistic. So like I said, when I close a casket and I say their name, that's my kind of way of keeping myself in check, that I'm actually doing what I'm doing and who I am. Dr. Nick, your thoughts?
The first question is, how long did it take you to adjust? It didn't take me to adjust, because the reality was I was always around it. It just becomes normalized, right? Especially as a child, children, again, are not taught to judge or, inherently kids will see things very concrete, like, oh, it's just another body, or it's just another person, or it's just grandpa, or whatever. They don't incorporate like what death is and death anxiety and all that stuff. So I think as growing up, like, seeing the first dead body didn't scare me. I guess that would be the first answer to the question. Have I become numb around death? I think, again, what Ben was alluding to was this idea that I think as you work in these positions, whether you're a funeral director or whether you're a grief and loss counselor, you almost have to have a shield to that. You almost have to be able to push that away when you need to, and be there for the family that needs you the most. I'm not saying that you can't show emotion, you can't shed a tear, but in those moments of time when everything is chaotic and everything's fallen to crap, I wanted to say the S word there. I'm trying to hold back. No. But when everything is fallen to crap, you need to be the stable one in the room, because you need to help guide them through this chaos. So yes, you do become numb to it. But I think that's the important part of having hobbies, and that is the important part of talking about it with people and trying desperately not to break confidentiality. And then the last question, how do you deal with it? Through my life, there has been healthy and unhealthy ways of dealing with that, right? Unhealthy ways, obviously, alcohol. And, obviously, if you look into one of the issues with a lot of funeral directors out there, unfortunately, is alcoholism. And it makes sense, because it's one of those jobs where you can't talk about what you're doing because people don't want to talk about it. People don't want to hear it. So therefore you have to hide it. And any time a human being hides their emotions or feelings, they fester, which turns into anxiety, depression, PTSD, all that stuff, which is not good. But with the healthy ones, I want to say this. It is so important to take care of yourself, whether that is reading a good book or calming or relaxing yourself or taking a bubble bath when you need to. And, I know that sounds really silly, but for a lot of us, just sitting in a warm tub, I think of the Friends episode. I think it's Chandler and and he goes he's like, I don't understand why you like bubble baths, blah blah, and then he starts having them, and then like he secretly goes in and has bubble baths all the time. But again, like I said, I use humor because it's so important because you need to laugh. If you're not laughing, you're not living. And I guess that's my answers to your questions. How do I deal with it? Humor, 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 humor.
All right, we're going to close. I want to thank Benny and Dr. Nick again for having me on the show. If you have any questions, please reach out. Let's talk about deathpod@gmail.com. Share with your friends. Talk about this, please. We really, really appreciate you spreading the word out. Reviews are huge. If you like us, like I said, review, give it to us. We want feedback because, hey, if you're not talking about death,
You ain't living.
living.
Have a great night.
Good night,
everybody.
everybody.